Hello, and good evening from Singapore. I am Lauren Sorkin, Executive Director of the Resilient Cities Network, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone here today to Cities on the Frontline, our speaker series. Cities on the Frontline is a virtual thought leadership series that began in 2020, co-organized by the Resilient Cities Network and the World Bank. These sessions have the objective of sharing best practices with all of you, visionary leaders on the front line of coping with increasing and cascading risks and vulnerabilities, while at the same time creating incredible opportunity for all city dwellers. We've taken advantage of this third session of Cities on the Frontline to share an insightful and inspiring discussion among notable city leaders from the Asia Pacific region that came together this past December for the Understanding Risks Asia Conference. The City Leaders panel focused on the importance of maintaining vision in a world with increasing risks that have been further exacerbated by the pandemic. Please note that if you wish to revisit this material at any time, it will be available on the Resilient Cities Network website by next week. I would like to give a very special thanks to my co-host for the Cities on the Frontline series, Francis Gesquier, the practice manager for disaster risk management and urban development in East Asia at the World Bank. Without further ado, let us move over to the session. We do hope you enjoy. I am thrilled because tonight we have a really fantastic representation from the west to the east of the Asia Pacific region here. We have leaders from cities within the Resilient Cities Network with a wide-ranging experience. Let me introduce them now. We have with us the Honorable Mayor Hemali Boghawala, who is the 35th mayor of the City of Surat in Gujarat state in India, one of the fastest growing cities in the country. And she has been a member of the BJP for the past 2 decades. She was formerly director of the Gujarat State Road Transportation Corporation. And just last month, Surat was declared the second cleanest city in India. The Honorable Mayor received an award from the President himself in India. So congratulations on that recent honor. We also have with us Ms. Elaine Tan, who is the Deputy Director for the Center for Livable Cities here in Singapore. And Elaine is the Deputy Director of Research. And this is a company, the Center for Livable Cities, under the Ministry of National Development. And formerly, Elaine was serving as the Director of Strategic Research and the Director of Architecture and Urban Design Excellence at the Urban Redevelopment Authority. And if you've ever been to Singapore, you know that's a very big job. At CLC, Elaine is spearheading new research frontiers in the area of building resilience, climate change, aging, health, and well-being. And last but certainly not least, we have one of the longest serving, but now former Chief Resilience Officers in the Resilient Cities Network, and that's Mike Gillooly from Christchurch, New Zealand. He was appointed as the first Chief Resilience Officer in the city in 2014 after serving local government with his strong background in engineering for more than 20 years. And he has managed projects with the Land Information of New Zealand, Earthquake Commission, and the Ministry of Building and Innovation. So thrilled to have you all here with us tonight. I'm going to kick us off now with a first question for our panel. And that is, how do you, in your role leading in a city, currently take account of various risks facing your city? What is it that you think through? How does your city address cascading risks, processes, data gathering? How do you do this work? And maybe I can start with the Honorable Mayor for this question.
Thank you for invite, Surat, ma'am. There are numbers of risks related to climate change which directly impacts this economy, ecosystem, infrastructure, and social harmony, and so and so. Extreme weather event is major concern for our city. Based on previous shocks experienced by Surat, we are trying to develop its resilient capacity through various information and modeling in water, drainage, transport, and waste sectors.
Thank you for that response, clearly there are a lot of different kinds of risks that must be considered. Mike, you've been thinking about this work as a chief resilience officer, and then also even helping other governments to prioritize risk as well. When you start an assignment thinking about cascading risk in a city, where do you start and how do you structure this work?
Great question. And interestingly, just before we started this session, we were talking with Elaine, and we all kind of hold Singapore up as the model of urban planning and livable cities. And Elaine goes, her response was, "Goodness me, we've got a long way to go. Do you really think we're the model?" But I was kind of thinking about Elaine's response and what we do here in Christchurch. And at the risk of sounding really boring, it happens within a really strong legislative framework, if you know what I mean. And that legislative framework drives cities to approach their long-term planning in a really structured way. So the things that we're required to do in Christchurch are required to be done in Wellington, are required to be done in Auckland and in the smaller towns and cities. So first of all, a really kind of uniform approach to actually making sure cities approach their long-term planning with the deep understanding of risk is kind of how we approach it here in New Zealand. I could say more, but I think I'd let others dive in.
Elaine, anything you'd like to add to that from the model city of Singapore?
So thank you very much for that compliment. I wouldn't say we are the model city, but we do our best. But I'll just like to say that in the face of crisis or risk management, resilience is of course very important, but resilience is more than just the infrastructure, hardware resilience. It has got to do a lot with the community resilience as well, the software side of things. So it's only by tackling both the hardware as well as engaging the software aspects that you can truly build a resilient city.
Can I just build on that a little bit, Lauren? Can I just jump in? Because one of the things I think that Singapore does particularly well, and that I think we've just done well recently in one of our strategies is in order to be clear about risk, you also have to be clear about your objectives. You know what it is you're trying to achieve, and what the uncertainty inherent in achieving those objectives is actually defines your risk. And that's why I think Singapore does that very, very well, because you've got this, I think there's a clearly articulated set of objectives as a nation or as a city-state. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from Singapore. And most recently, we've been doing that down here too, in terms of clearly defining the objectives to identify the uncertainty and the risk and the mitigations and controls around not achieving those objectives. So I think a clearly articulated vision, objectives and objectives are really critical, absolutely critical. And they can cover all the things I think that Elaine was talking about, whether it's the hard infrastructure side, but also that softer community resilience side, which is equally important.
We also discuss about how resilience is also not something that you build overnight. It has to be something that you have planned over a long term. And I think that's what Singapore does a lot. We plan for the long term. And so when a crisis hits, we are better. We have the infrastructure in place to help enable us to overcome some of the initial stress and shocks. And then that's when we have to rely and leverage on the strength of the community and that spirit to overcome and also to transform ourselves to truly, adapt and be more resilient. So it's not enough to just survive. We also have to transform and strive. And actually on that note, when we talk about both the physical infrastructure and the software and the community infrastructure, it is really about taking a systems approach to things. And that's how we look at it over here at the Center for Livable Cities, because the more aspects you are looking at and the more they are interdependent and intertwined, the more you must have a systems approach to looking at it, as a full system, because then you are able to fully leverage on the full potential and synergies that arise out of it. And this is, I suppose, how we are able to answer Lauren's question. How do we look at the effects of the cascading risk, and how do we deal with it?
And then when we were discussing before the session, you mentioned the long-term planning approach of Singapore, which I think is one of the source of what you're doing today. Could you elaborate on this? And then I want to push Mike a little bit, because I think you have a point there, Mike, that having a clear regulatory framework is fundamental. In New Zealand, has this come about through the various crises that have happened over the last 15 years, or is it something that was well in place before? And how do you explain that countries have better structured system than other? But let's go to Elaine first on long-term planning in Singapore.
Yeah. So as we were sharing earlier, the idea about resilience and risk management is a topic that's very close to Singapore's heart, given that we are no stranger to resilience challenges, because since independence, we have been a city and a country in the same space. We have limited land, we have limited water, and we also import our energy. So that said, it was very important for us to set the foundation for our continual growth and development. So as I mentioned to you, probably resilience is already part of our DNA. And so now looking into the future at the increasing number of crises that we have, whether it comes with climate change, sea level rise, and we're going to look at heat stress becoming more of an issue, and with that a lot of vector-borne diseases. What more can we do? And we're going to again transform. We are at the cusp of it. We're going to transform again, and we're going to take on a long-term approach. And I think that is evident in the recent Singapore Green Plan that you have seen, that has been announced earlier this year. And it does state our ambitions over the next 10 years with concrete targets and goals. And continually, we are taking on that approach. So when Francis mentioned, they are nice that there are parks and all that where people can go to, especially during the period of the pandemic, we must remember that those parks didn't come about by chance. The amenities that we have close to homes in our HDB towns did not come along by chance either. It was all due to careful, judicious long-term planning.
Michael, Singapore has the advantage of being one state, one city, one system. Yeah. Everything is aligned. New Zealand is slightly different.
But we're still an island, right?
As well, yeah. Yeah. We'll then go back to India and where Mayor Hemali faces a much bigger challenge, I believe. But let's stick with New Zealand for a little while.
Yeah. Before we hit the complexities of Indian cities, which I think dwarf our own. Good question. New Zealand's been evolving in terms of its understanding of risk, probably since about the 1930s. Most people probably know that we're very seismically active, and in the 1930s we had, I think, around 7 or 8 magnitude 8 or greater earthquakes within a decade. And the government of the day really thought deeply about how do we absorb the impact financially of these multiple, sort of crises, and the cascading effects of rebuilding towns and cities and municipal infrastructure. And at that point, the whole Earthquake Commission and our National Disaster Fund and our seeding of risk offshore began. And so since the 1930s, New Zealand has really as a result of that, has done a number of things. We've got very well developed building codes. We've started to develop more refined planning laws, and we've become a much more insured nation, to the extent that in 2010 or 11, I think the number of residential homes that were insured were about 96% penetration of the insurance market, into Christchurch City, and 89% in the commercial. So 96% residential, 89% commercial. So New Zealand has kind of had this wired into the DNA, its DNA, this ability to weather the financial shock. But what we probably haven't done so well is the slower moving threats or disruptions, like urban growth, like climate change, and we're really starting to grapple with those now, particularly urban growth and transportation and building livable cities and intensification. Those things are really, even though we've got good regulatory frameworks and legislative requirements, it is only relatively in more recent times that we're really turning our mind to that, particularly with a climate lens.
Let's come back to future crisis in a minute, but I wanted to give a chance to Mayor Hemali, who faces, I believe, massive challenge in her view on the regulatory framework in India, and how a city like Surat organizes itself to deal with a variety of risk and not just COVID. So Mayor Hemali, over to you.
Future risk and its impact on Surat cannot be measured. At Surat Municipal Corporation, to our best understanding, we are evaluating future risks. In order to take climate action, Surat has identified many mitigation and adaptation measures. Capacity building, development, technological identification, and climate financing are some of our challenges while addressing future risks. And collaboration and communication are the two major tools by which we can lead city residents in future. Cooperation with industries of the region can support addressing climate impacts, social instability, and economic uncertainty. Continuous engagement of people is the main key, along with involvement of all industries of the city. Keep doing something at levels is the mantra. Cost of doing nothing is much more than cost of doing something.
I kind of fully agree. The cost of doing nothing is going to be much higher. But I also like what you said, Mayor Hemali, about engaging both with communities and the industry. At the end, you need everybody on board to be able to address risk. Let's switch and maybe look at the future, right? We have a tendency, I think in general, to always prepare for the last war. In this case, I think a lot of cities, a lot of us are looking at how do we get ready for the next pandemic? But next crisis may not be a pandemic. It may be a completely different kind of hazards. And I'm curious to hear your views, Mayor and Mike and Elaine, about what have we learned from this crisis that could be useful in the future in general, and what you're doing today to address future crises. Maybe we'll start with you, Elaine, and then you, Mike, and then back to you, Mayor. And then I'll give it back to Lauren, because I know she has more questions, and we're always fighting to ask our questions. So over to you, Elaine.
Okay, sure, Francis. So how are we going to deal with the future crisis? Well, the thing is, it will always be a black swan and we will never know what it would be. But it's always important to anticipate and be prepared than to be caught off guard and surprise. So as I was saying, recently with the COVID situation, we have done a study over here at the CLC to look at how we had been dealing with the COVID situation. It is not the be all and end all because the situation is still evolving, but we have put up a commentary to see at this point, what have we been doing, what has been done, and how has it played out. And it was really a commentary on how we're doing for future learning purposes and to document this very important point in history on how we are dealing with it. Going forward, over here at the CLC, we are starting to do studies at the very early stages to look at how we can prepare for disease X. That could be the future crisis. And we never know what the disease X will be like, how it's going to transmit, in what form. But we're starting to speak to some epidemiologists and medical experts to understand what it could be. And from there, we are also going to bridge that conversation with planners, architects, real estate developers, insurance companies, all the different actors and players in society, including the community, to see how they will envision that and how they will respond to that. Or rather, what do they hope to achieve, or how would they like to come out of that next crisis? Because it's very important to understand from everybody's and different players' point of view what they think it would be and what is important to them. And this is how we develop what we call, again, a systems approach. And we're looking at how the entire ecosystem of stakeholders can come together and rally together to overcome the next crisis. And we have learned from the recent COVID situation that it takes the entire village, town, or city to overcome any crisis together. And we hope to continue on that track.
Thank you, Elaine. Indeed, it takes a village. I think that is a recurrent message in all our Cities on the Frontline speaker series. Everybody has to be involved if we are to build resilience. Mike, over to you.
Yeah, I really liked Elaine's framing, particularly at the start there when, Elaine, you mentioned, we can, we're going to get these black swan events, and we're going to need to anticipate that they will happen. And I go back to Judith Rodin, the former president of the Rockefeller Foundation, in her book, The Resilience Dividend. And she metaphorically, and these are my words, gave us the three resilience horsemen of the apocalypse, if you will: climate change, urbanization, and globalization. And I think I think the cities need to understand that disruption is the new normal. That's fundamentally what Judith was saying in her book. Disruption is the new normal, and what's different about the 21st century is that climate change, globalization, and urbanization are relatively new phenomena that cities in earlier centuries didn't have to face at this scale. So I think it is incumbent on cities to have a clear kind of set of organizing principles around how they frame up future disruption. And I think using climate change, we're part of a global economy. Cities are becoming more and more urbanized, or countries are becoming more and more urbanized. And you can think about your future and disruption in that way. And I'll just add one more thing. Elaine's absolutely right. The black swans are going to come along. And what we've learned is that by dealing with the slower moving threats or the slower moving stressors, we actually prepare our cities to absorb the impact of these black swans when they do happen. So you could be addressing climate change and climate equity and thereby addressing equity generally. And the mere fact that you're having those conversations and the deep collaborations, when you do have that sudden shock, you are in a much, much better position. So, I really do go back to those three organising principles. I don't think Judith called them the resilience horsemen of the apocalypse. That's me.
It's interesting that two of these horsemen, Mike, can also be sources, like you say, for more equity, for good. It's clear that it's going to be
100%.
difficult to address climate change without urbanization done right? Urbanization done the wrong way is a problem. Done right is part of the solution. At least.
Let's look at Singapore, the model. Let's look at Singapore, the model city.
Yeah, or Christchurch, the model city. I think you guys are all doing pretty well. So let's go to you, Mayor Hemali. It's a tough question to address, right? How do we prepare for future crisis? But you, more than anybody, is probably at the forefront of a potential crisis. Over to you.
The kind uncertainty prevailed during COVID-19. None on earth knew what to do. This pandemic taught us how to face casualty in uncertain times. In a time of crisis, Surat Municipal Corporation worked in collaboration with state and national governments, along with NGOs, industries, and various citizen forum. Our understanding to risks of any kind has increased. Surat Corporation is graded up to face any such challenge in future.
I think there's a lot to pick up on, Francis, in the last few answers that we heard about future crises, about involving citizens. And then, both inherent in your comments and Mike's, there's a lot about the way you're framing these challenges. And I think sometimes it can get overwhelming. So I think one of the questions that we wanted to ask this very diverse group is, what have you really learned from the past year or so of these cascading crises in terms of how do you break down these issues? How do you communicate about risk with the public in a way that is really mobilizing and manageable rather than something that invokes fear and anxiety? If you want the community to be part of the solution, what have you learned about communicating risks? And I see you nodding, Elaine, so maybe I'll come to you first.
Maybe we should let Mike have a go first.
Yeah, I'm ready to answer it. Look, that's a great question, and our mayor, Leanne Dalzell, has a very good metaphor for this, born out of the earthquakes. That neither a top-down nor a bottom-up approach works. And that when you combine the top-down approach with a bottom-up approach, the combined wisdom of both will exceed what one can do without the other. Governments can't do it on their own. They will always get it wrong. If they try, they may get it partly right, but they'll never get it as right as they could if they don't engage through deep collaboration with communities and groups. So the corollary, of course, is that groups and community groups on their own can't organise on their own to achieve. So we need each other, and so the learnings for us is that the collaboration has to be meaningful. It has to be deep. It's got to be well curated. And take time, because fundamentally, right at the core of this is trust. And actually, that's one of my big worries about the pandemic, is that through this crisis, that some cities may or no, some populations may not trust their governments as much as they did. So I think there is a big risk for something for us to be mindful of when we're engaging in further conversations around risk during a time of a global pandemic, because it's a very crowded place to have a conversation at the moment. You're getting economies up and running, borders are opening, people are getting their lives back together, and you want to go in there and talk about the next big thing. And we're not even through this thing. So, that taking time and building trust is going to be absolutely key. Over.
Riding on Mike's point, I think from this pandemic, we are also able to see it play out in Singapore. And one of the points that we made in our COVID commentary published by CLC is that the communities themselves, they have an instinct to self-mobilize and to take collective action together. And in such a case, what government has to do is to really provide the correct and accurate information and the various platforms for them to connect. And businesses as well will also be finding opportunities to do their part, as we have seen in Singapore. So like we mentioned earlier, it really takes the entire ecosystem to come together. And so we see it play out in Singapore in the early part of 2020 when we had a circuit breaker. People came forward to produce sanitizers. Housewives were producing sanitizers from simple materials and liquids and putting it together in the lifts, common lifts and in lift lobbies, so that people are able to use it and keep the entire community in their block safe. So that is an important part, to bring the community together and everybody can galvanize collective action. Over.
Based on communication with citizens on regular intervals, it is evident that people of Surat are very clear about future risks. Air pollution has waves, heat waves, epidemic and food floods on priority. Citizens are the first response in any crisis, hence communication and motivation are challenges. Active participation of NGOs and citizen groups in spreading awareness work effectively in city. Also, Surat Municipal Corporation social media deliberate channel supports conversation awareness programs.
This is very interesting. Is exactly where I wanted to go, Mayor Hemali. Is I think one thing we have learned, and all of us, I think I talk for all of us through this crisis, is how to communicate. Maybe not how to communicate, but that the need to communicate better. And I'm more exposed, of course, to Singapore since I live here, but in Singapore, even the words that are being used, you just mentioned the circuit breaker, whereas in most of the world, people talk about the lockdown, right? And the Ministry of Health established a WhatsApp group. Who would ever heard of a WhatsApp group before? And there's apps called Trace Together that everybody can use to monitor where they're going and whether they've been in a place. So could you elaborate on what you've learned on communication, how to communicate to the public, how to communicate between other departments over the last crisis, basically? Maybe again, starting with you, Elaine, and then Mike and Mayor. I think you very well illustrated this point, but if you want to add to it, that would be most welcome.
Yes, thanks, Francis. I think the thing about communication is that it has to, you have to go on all fronts, because you would definitely need different strokes for different folks. So there are people who will use the WhatsApp, which is the most common, and you must understand your demographic. And if people are using WhatsApp as the most common way of communication, then it's important to go in there and send information through that channel to them, which is most familiar or comfortable for them, and probably the fastest as well. So there are also people who may not have access to WhatsApp, maybe some really elderly senior folks who may not have a handphone, for instance. And that way you will really need befrienders groups, senior ambassadors. We have what we call the senior silver ambassadors, people who are able to reach out to the seniors and to communicate with them through telephone or through communication, of course, at a safe distance at their door, to make sure they're okay. We also took the opportunity to galvanize the community to check in on their older seniors. So for instance, check in on them if they're okay, and during the circuit breaker, whether they need food and somebody to help them do the marketing and shopping and to deliver it to their homes. So I think, as I just mentioned, it's really different strokes for different folks at all front. And that is how we are dealing with the current situation, and to provide transparent and very timely updates and information. So if you're on that WhatsApp group, Francis, you will be aware that you do get an update every day on how many cases there are and how we're doing. And I think learning from that, it is also important to look at the next frontier of a potential crisis that we should not forget and is still there, lurking in the background, and that is climate change. And very importantly for that, it again requires a whole of government effort, it is whole of society effort, and it's long term. And what's important then is to consolidate all the different efforts so that it is in one place and that everybody has access to it and everybody understands it in totality, comprehensively, and across the different systems. Because like we mentioned, there is a complex urban systems and there are so many interdependencies. So therefore, earlier this year, I mentioned earlier, there was the launch of the Singapore Green Plan. And in one place, we chart out and put out all the challenges we have and all the future transformative plans we have, as well as the concrete targets. So by doing so, then people have a platform to go to and say, okay, so this is where the information is, this is where we're heading, and everybody can start in their own collective way, in their own way of self-mobilization to already start to do things on their own, perhaps. So to do that, we also try to encourage grounds-up effort. And so there is the SG, what we call the Singapore Eco Fund. And the Singapore Eco Fund is a $50 million fund that was launched in the middle of this pandemic at the end of last year. And already we had quite good responses. We had more than 37 projects to date that have been granted funds. And that said, what is important is that we must always remember to connect the bottoms-up aspiration with the top-down national goals together, a bit like what Mike mentioned earlier, to connect that so that we're able to form an entire spectrum of solutions, ranging from citizen tree work that are crowdsourced, that are crowdfunded, that are citizen-initiated, all the way to the ones that are long-term investment with high capex costs, that needs, that are public assets, and that needs maintenance from professionals. So that needs to always be that spectrum that we should be looking at in dealing with any of our crises and in transformation and for any of our solutioning.
Thanks, and I like how you come back to Mike's first point, which was the importance of having a very clear vision, a very clear sense of where we're going, and making sure people are aware of this vision. I also like the expression different stroke for different folks. I'm going to use that. This conference is a lot about with communication, so I'm sure people are taking notes. Mike, in New Zealand, you have an amazing Prime Minister. I must say she's really impressive. The other day I was watching her when her kids came into the room and how she handled it. Any lessons from the last 18 months? I'm sure she can teach us all, but what about Christchurch?
Yeah, well, I'm going to agree absolutely with everything that Elaine said. I could listen to Elaine all day, actually. You really are able to really so clearly kind of articulate the messages really well, Elaine. But what I took out of, and I'd like to expand upon Elaine's little discourse, was this issue of accessibility. Information's got to be risk information has to be accessible, and you've got to use multiple channels. And there is no one single channel. We know that people take in information and they engage with information differently. So multiple channels. And I would just add one thing onto what Elaine said, and that is the importance of data and the importance of insights, and how it's important to make sure that we continue to work hard to provide the data to populations, and that's either to communities or business and commerce, but also the what if, the insights that go with the data. Bearing in mind that the insights that I might apply to some flooding information, for example, may not be the same as someone who's buying a house in that area. So insights are equally important. And I think we haven't really discussed data here in this session, but I think there's a very much a pressing need to make sure that data in and of itself is accessible and transparent and available to everybody through multiple channels. Yeah,
I couldn't agree.
Yeah,
couldn't agree more, Michael. I mean, I think a lot of the session in this understanding risk Asia is really about how data becomes inside, but also what people make of it, and how do you make sure that the message gets through in this world where there's so much noise with social media, so much noise with different source of information, sometimes not as accurate as we wish. This is a real challenge.
I also think just leaping in there, and Elaine and Hemali, I'd be keen on your insights. But one of my observations, and I'm going to have to go in a second. One of my observations working in the city and with other cities is we are really well practiced at articulating issues, but we're very, very poor generally at defining the problem. You know, climate change is the issue, absolutely. But what is the problem for the city to solve around climate change? Is it investment in infrastructure that is only going to last 100 years when climate change is going to, that infrastructure is going to be affected much sooner than that? So I think there's something in this whole understanding risk around being much smarter at defining the problem. And getting away from maybe just kicking the can down the road by just merely talking about the issues.
What you define by the problem is really how it affects people, the people you're talking to. Am I correct?
Yeah. I mean, are we trying to solve climate change? I don't think we're trying to solve climate change necessarily in our cities. We are responding to climate change. We are going to lower emissions. We are going to invest more in a circular economy. We are going to think differently about investing in harder in-ground infrastructure in low-lying coastal areas to achieve or avoid an outcome, or to achieve a set of climate-related objectives. But I think we really need to be smarter about defining the problems so that we can see the solutions much more clearly.
Mike, I just want to thank you for your intervention, and it's really been a pleasure to have you with us. And building on what you said as you duck it out of here, I think that defining the problem and responding, linking with other agencies at either a national level or related agencies becomes so important. And so it'd be great to hear from the mayor and also from Elaine on how you really build that coalition to get at the problem, right, and responding to the problems of managing the risk. And again, thanks, Mike, for being here with us. Maybe we can come to you, Mayor Hemali, to hear your response on risk and also engaging with partners.
Yes, I want to inform one thing. Thanks to our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, that Surat Municipal Corporation has a system of volunteers that take the message to community by going door to door during COVID. Reach the triple T procedure of tracking, testing, and treatment. Because of that, Surat received highest COVID recovery rate award in India.
So that's one of the examples of collaborating with national and local government. I think that's a useful one to consider. And Elaine, you talked about the different kinds of support that are available. Obviously, Singapore is a bit of a different case as a city-state, but how do you build those coalitions that you need to respond to risks?
Yeah, so there are various ways in which we could help enable that coalition. We shouldn't be the ones that are going in to build that community directly, but rather we should let it be citizen-led. So on that front, Singapore has during this period, coincidentally, just before the COVID-19 reached our shores, we launched a Singapore Together effort. And that is really to galvanize citizens to take collective action on certain issues that they believe in or have interest in, and to really make a difference. And during the period of COVID, we have also done we were able to continue with a very important piece of work. And Lauren, you are aware, and it was a RCN, CLC project, joint effort together with our other many partners, which is the project at Cambridge Road. And that was a very important exercise for us because it is about building a sense of community resilience that is citizen-led, and where we play an enabling and facilitating role. So it is entirely grounds-up initiative, and even during the period of pandemic, when we thought that we would have to scale down on our events, it was actually the citizen champions themselves who insisted on keeping the momentum going and sustaining those efforts. And to today, they have already, during the period of pandemic, initiated 20 over initiatives, big and small, some planned, some ongoing, some completed. And that, I think, was a very important case study for us as we do our research, because it does show that community resilience can be measured, although it does seem to be a very intangible aspect to measure, but it can be done. And interventions can help in building community resilience. So on that aspect, I would also like to thank Lauren. Really, that was a good project that we work on together, and it really showed that it is extremely important to build that software aspect of resilience, which was how we started this conversation nearly an hour ago, really about software and hardware coming together to truly build a resilient city.
Thanks, Elaine. And I think that is bringing things full circle here. The right note that we want to close on tonight. I think we've heard really clear messages from the mayor, from you, from Mike, about how we consider risk, how we really need to integrate data, how the community must be center to any kind of resilience building, as well as understanding what we're up against and what we're trying to solve for. So a lot of powerful lessons that cities around the world can apply as they move to better understand and manage their risk. And I think with that, I just want to thank you both for being on this panel, being part of the Understanding Risk conference, and again to thank the World Bank for creating this community and this platform for sharing knowledge and for moving this work ahead.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for
Elaine,
being here.
I'll remember different stroke for different folks. I think that's going to stick. Maybe it'll become one of the motto for the Understanding Risk community. Thank you, everyone.
Right, and you heard it here first at this panel, this very important panel. organized by you
line.
guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Stay strong, stay safe.